So standard three is looking at equity and cultural responsiveness. Effective educational leaders strive for equity of educational opportunity and cultural responsiveness. Practices to promote each student's academic success and well-being. Being in China, quite frankly, it's not so much about race, because I feel like, for the most part, I think that to be Chinese, I think most people here would say that all my students are Chinese. Race may play a small factor. Um, um, there are sometimes, quote, darker skinned Chinese people. And I've heard stories from friends of mine where they were picked on as kids because they were considered darker skinned Chinese. But for the most part, in the 19th, 20th centuries, to be Chinese was a national concept. Before the 19th century, to be Chinese wasn't a national concept. It was more, you were from Shanghai or Beijing or Xinjiang. Today, people consider themselves to be Chinese. So when it comes to race and ethnicity, I mean, there are different groups of people who live in China. There's the Han, who make up the majority of Chinese. Like I said, Xinjiang province, where many people are Muslims. But for the most part, the majority of people who live in China are Han. So I'm thinking more about academic equity. Students who may have learning disabilities or struggle academically. That is a problem here in China because it still hasn't really been addressed. There are two types of students here in China. There are those who are special education, which means low IQ. Back in the States, they would be considered, quote, mentally retarded. I know we don't say that anymore. We call them, excuse me, we call them special needs students today. But that's the two groups. You have special needs on one end, and then you have students. So there's no gray area. You're either intellectually disabled, or you're normal, and that's the biggest challenge when we talk about equity and cultural responsiveness. Um, Now, I believe about 2 or 3 years ago, China actually, I'm sorry, 2021, China actually put forth a policy called the Provisions for School Protection for Minors, and it pretty much laid the guidelines for uh, safety and the well-being of Chinese students. Uh, Good example is a lot of the learning centers, the training centers here in China closed down in 2021 because the government felt like parents were paying a lot of money for these services to teach children English, and quite frankly, the schools should be providing these tools, not these training centers in which parents were paying 100,000, 200,000 RMB, which is roughly anywhere from 10 to 30,000 USD per year to teach their children like English and other skills. In order to encourage the birth rate here in China, like if you're paying 10 to 30,000 US dollars a year for educational services, then people are not going to have two, three, four kids. And so I think part of the reason why they banned a lot of these training centers, these English training centers, is to encourage people to have more children. So you see now, a focus on less homework, less classwork, making sure the kids actually have, like fun time. They're kind of leaning into a Western approach education where, students shouldn't be like at home for 4 or 5 hours a day studying, which is interesting because, I worked at a high school now for the past year, and it's easy for political change, but it's harder for actual social change. I think parents are still hammering down the fact that, yeah, you're going to study for 4, 5, 6 hours a night and go to school between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and then do it again and again and again. So even though the government has began these regulations, parents are still not really doing this much in terms of making sure their children have more time for free time. Um, I know what our school is doing is, quite frankly, when it comes to protection of the students, is more of a Western approach. like not encouraging bullying, focusing on sexual harassment, focusing on like rumorville stuff like that, like making sure that the students have a community where they feel safe. Now they don't go into detail about like sexual orientation, but it's implied that the bullying also focuses on the fact that like we're here to create an environment that protects students, so that they can understand themselves better. And by blocking that, um, um, you're impacting the student's ability to learn more about themselves. And so, even though it's not directly stated in the handbook, it just feels like when you talk about sexual orientation, like yeah, like the purpose is to make sure that students feel safe on our campus. So once again, focusing on bullying, focusing on inappropriate relationships, um, but also, like I said, coming from a Western, culture, there's a bit of an emphasis on making sure that students feel safe enough to explore, themselves. So here's some links. So standard four, looking at curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Effective educational leaders develop and support intellectual rigorous and coherent systems of culture, curriculum, instruction, and assessment to promote each student's academic success and well-being. When I think about Our school is an international school, not an international program. International schools actually they are allowed to teach history and English to Chinese students. So we're looking at global education, trying to let our students know that yes, you are a member of a global society, and so you should learn more about what other people are doing outside of China. Are you talking? When it comes to curriculum, I already told you about the fact that I'm new to the campus, so I'm still trying to figure out exactly what are the strengths and what are the areas of concern. The challenges that I face is that the Chinese government, the Ministry of Education, may change their mind and may say, you know what, no schools are allowed to teach history without having a local person in the classroom. At the moment, international schools are still allowed to teach U.S. history and European history, but that might change in the future, which means we have to focus more on other humanities courses like economics and psychology and sociology. But at the moment, we're still allowed to teach history, and so I'm going to move forward on the fact that we can do that. But things may happen. The government may say, you know what? We no longer want any foreign person to teach history to our students, and so we have to adjust based on what the government wants us to do. All right. Thank you once again for your time, and take care.